Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Poetry Book Society Instagram book club. I'm here, as usual, with Patricia the Pug, and she's feeling very happy with herself because she's had two dinners because she was fed, and then I came in from work and she pretended to me that she hadn't been fed, and so she's been fed again, and so she's had two dinners for the price of one, and so she'll probably fall asleep and feel very, very happy with herself as we go through. I'm delighted that you're all joining us for another special edition of this Instagram online book club, and we're back in lockdown, but tonight we're going to take flight with two very different but very exciting books. We've got Matthew Sweeney, the great late Matthew Sweeney, Shadow of the Owl from Blood Axe Books, and we've got The Gaze by Ni Ayikwei Parks. And not only two really important books, but also two of our very best independent publishers as well in Blood Axe and People Tree Press. And so it's great to be able to celebrate them tonight as well. And so thank you all very much for joining and for coming along tonight. As I say, we're going to be chatting to our PBS wildcard selector, first of all this evening, Anthony Anaxagorou, and we're going to be talking to him about his choice of Matthew Sweeney for the Poetry Book Society Winter Wildcard choice. And then we're going to move on to talk to the great and the wonderful Ni Ayikwei Parks and to discuss his new collection, The Gaze, that's just come out from People Tree Press, that we were fortunate enough to give a Poetry Book Society recommendation to for winter 2020. And so we'll start off by thinking about Matthew Sweeney, and we'll have that conversation. And then probably about 25 to 8, we'll bring me in, and then we'll discuss his book as well, and hear as well from both books. And thank you all very much, everyone that's joining us this evening. I can even see the great Fred Degas, who, of course, is the Poetry Book Society Winter Choice. And so thank you very much to Fred for joining us, and I'm hoping that we can do one of these book clubs with him in the very near future. And so before we do get started, I just want to flag up that this is actually the last chance that you have to join the Poetry Book Society in order to get the winter mail out. And so the winter bulletin contains reviews written by myself and Sinead and Anthony of all the books that have been chosen in the winter selection, as well as really interesting write-ups and blurbs from many other books that are published each quarter. So of course, as you know, there are so many books published each quarter, each year, that it's always incredibly hard to choose, to make these decisions about what should be the choice, what should be the recommendations, what should get the special commendation. There's a wealth of books that we could have chosen, but they do get mentioned and do get reviewed in the bulletin as well. So this is the last chance to sign up for that bulletin. The cut-off is the 15th of November, so if you join before the 15th of November on the standard membership, you'll get the Winter 2020 Bulletin, and you'll also get a copy of Fred Degas' Letters to America, which is the Poetry Book Society Winter Choice. If you join up as a complete member, you'll also get The Gaze, one of the recommendations, alongside the other recommendations, which this winter are Safia Sinclair's Cannibal, Bill Manhire's Wow, and Daisy Lafarge's Life Without Air. So that's quite a selection of books that you'll get if you sign up as a complete member to the Poetry Book Society as well. And the special commendation, of course, for winter was the brilliant Staying Human anthology that Blood Axe do as well. And so they're also, PBS have also still got the offer on where you'll get a £10 book voucher for any, if you're a new member as well, and that book voucher will allow you to purchase anything from the Poetry Book Society shop, so any of the books that are in the magazine that you don't have, but also any contemporary poetry books that have been published in the last few years. And so that's my little spiel. Join the Poetry Book Society. I think it's an incredible force for good within the poetry world, and will continue to be so, hopefully. And it's always a joy and a thrill to be able to select for them. But then not only that, to be able to have these conversations with the poets themselves as well, and to think more in depth about some of the books that we've chosen. And of course, as some of you are already doing, do interact with us, say hello in the comments, but also ask questions, both of Anthony and of Ni, as we go through, and I'll do my best. I've got my glasses on so I can actually see the comments at the bottom. I'll do my best to pitch those questions and those thoughts to the guests as we go through this hour, and we'll be wrapped up by 8 p.m, just in time for bed. And so, first of all, I'm going to bring in Anthony Anaxagorou, who is the PBS wildcard selector. And so his job is to choose a wildcard each time, which might otherwise pass under the radar, perhaps, or might otherwise not get talked about. And of course, we've talked to Anthony about his process before when we had Wayne Holloway-Smith on the show about kind of what that wildcard choice entails. And this time I was so delighted that Anthony had chosen Matthew Sweeney and his posthumous collection, Shadow of the Owl. And Matthew, of course, sadly passed in 2018, but it's so great that we've got this new collection from Blood Axe to remember him by. And so I'm just going to bring Anthony in now so that we can have a chat about Matthew Sweeney. Welcome, welcome.
Hello.
How's it going?
All right, man. All right. Can't complain. How are you?
Good, good. Not too bad, not too bad. All the better for seeing you, obviously.
All right. Yeah, likewise, likewise.
So, I mean, first of all, I guess I was just so thrilled when, you know, we make our choices, then I always see your choice after. So I was really thrilled that it was this book and that it was Matthew Sweeney. And I just wondered, first of all, what it was about this book that had made you want to choose it as the wildcard choice.
So my journey with Matthew Sweeney is that I knew of him over the years, but I'd never read him properly. I just read bits online in magazines and newspapers. And then when Poetry Magazine published the Owl sequence, I lost my shit. Like I fully read it, and I was just like, I rang up Jack Underwood and I just said to him, like, dude, this is flipping crazy. And he was like, yeah, I've kind of been saying that for a long time. And that was it. I think I stayed reading that, and then I spoke about it with friends. I was sending it around, and I became a little bit obsessed with what he was doing. I think technically, but also because of the fact that he was dying whilst he wrote it, it gave it an extra layer, that every line just rang in a way that when you know somebody, it's a bit like the Max Rittvo collection as well, you know, like when somebody's not well and they're ill and this is their kind of valedictory lap, it had that weight, that gravity to it that I felt just gave it an extra dimension. And I often wonder if it would have impacted me the same way had he been alive, or if he wasn't dying and if it was something different. But I just think what he did with the owl, existentially, the reckoning that goes on throughout the poems is just, it's so good, man.
Absolutely. And that's the sequence, isn't it, that opens the book, this kind of 12-part kind of moment of the owl. And I mean, for people that haven't read it yet, is it possible to kind of capture what is happening in it or what he is doing in it?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the owl, the reason why it's so clever is because the owl never stays as one thing throughout the sequences. It's constantly being kind of rehashed, reimagined, repositioned throughout the poems. And so the owl sometimes is death, sometimes is the unknown, or is wisdom, or is hope, or is a friend. There's a lot of moments in the poems where you think that Sweeney, or the speaker in the poems, is making friends, in a way accepting destiny or fate. And I think it's a really... And then there's other times where he just gets mad at the owl and just wants him to go and wants to live. But the owl has other plans. So yeah, I think it's this dialogue, this kind of tension that runs throughout the poems, and it changes temperament as the different sequences open up and move along. I just think it's an epic for me. Like, it's a very immersive read. You're in somebody's feelings, you're in their fears, their insecurities, their frustrations, you're in the kind of crux of it. And it's so difficult to calibrate language like that, particularly when you know that this isn't an embellishment, this is reality.
Yeah. And because so we open the owl sequence, and the book's called kind of Shadow of the Owl, and it struck me kind of when I was rereading it that as you're sort of saying, that first sequence, that opening sequence, that sets the mood music for the whole thing, doesn't it? Or that the kind of conceits or the preoccupations that come up in that are what come up in everything. That's what travels through the book with us, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. And you get that, and like he sets the tone right from the beginning. Like, it's not a happy place. Yeah. And I kind of feel that it's one of these kind of sequences that it takes you through a journey. And again, like I come back to the word immersive, because that's kind of what it feels like reading it. And then when I read it in the magazine, and then I read it in the book, and then you read the subsequent poems as well, that again are not as kind of face on, but they're all reckoning with this things that are extinct, or things that have died, or things that have passed on. Like these reoccurring motifs of things that, I don't know, in a way, maybe he was already accepted that that was it, and he kind of categorized himself as being part of that taxonomy. So I mean, it's just so good, man. Like, it's really brilliant. And I think I felt particularly enthused by it because I hadn't read him properly previously. He was always kind of peripheral writer for me. But then when I read that, I was like, all right, cool.
Well, I mean, that was one of the things I was wondering about, because for me, I think it was much the same. Like, he was someone who, like, I'd met a couple of times on the edges of literary festivals, or I'd kind of seen odd poems in anthologies and things like that, but he wasn't someone who I'd just ever had the space, or I'd never made the time to kind of read properly. And and that struck me as interesting, because he feels like such an important figure, but someone who's perhaps always on the periphery, or always on the edge of those kind of bigger names, as it were, or the names that everyone feels they should be reading. And I just wondered, not kind of why that is, but just, I guess, for our generation, it feels to me important that maybe more people do read him. I don't know.
I mean, I agree. I think that for me, it's kind of tragic in, like you say, the poets that I guess are writing into maybe bigger ideas, more kind of like engaging with the political landscape head on. They kind of eclipse the more experimental avant-garde, maybe even the existential writers. And I think I mean, with me, I was always gravitated towards writers that were polemical, writers that had like an academic historical bent. And I always felt that I missed out on the more, I mean, I would say Sweeney for me is largely existential. You know, it is about Sweeney and his life and the things that encompass that. And so that's, for me, that's kind of why I felt maybe I overlooked him, because he wasn't writing about injustices and oppression and biases and prejudice and all the rest of it, which is the stuff that I naturally end up gravitating towards, because that's my kind of preoccupations. So I think that's it. But definitely he'd fit in the milieu right now. I think, you know, like as a voice, as a register, as a tone, he'd very much be at home with what's happening in the poetry landscape at the moment here.
And I think, I mean, because in that, we get in the book as well, there's this really beautiful introduction by Mary Noonan that sort of kind of sets it up and talks about Matthew's kind of final years and things. And she in that talks about his spirit, like just the poet spirit of Matthew Sweeney. But it struck me that one of the things that comes out so much in this book and in other poems of his that I've read is the voice of it, this voice that has a real lyric beauty to it, but just this kind of ease of cadence as well. It's like he's chatting to you. It's like you say, it's existential stuff. It's quite difficult stuff sometimes. I find it quite hard to wrestle with sometimes, but there's an ease of diction, and the kind of the way that he says it makes it so smooth, doesn't it, somehow on the page?
Yeah. I mean, I was just reading, when you sent me the PDF, I was having a read through, and I remembered some of my favorite ones. And I was like, it's exactly that. It's chatty, like it's chatty poetry. Yeah. It's the poetry that you could sit around a pub or a table and you can hear someone saying it. Like, it's not syntactical, it's not disruptive, it's not doing anything of anything like that. But then at the same time, there is a level of profundity that runs, like a philosophy even, that runs through the kind of subtext that I think just adds that layer to it. And I think, like you say, it's really difficult to calibrate language like that, to have it perform in such a conversational manner. You know, the Frank O'Hara's and the kind of New York school, maybe they kind of started to pioneer that thing. But with Sweeney has his own, it feels too chatty sometimes. It feels like, you know, it feels like he's going to say, can you pass the salt or something like that.
Yeah. And it is, isn't it? It's that chatty and kind of quite casual discourse, but as you mentioned, kind of put against kind of philosophical or existential ideas. And so oftentimes we think, you know, Frank O'Hara or someone like that, just telling the minutiae of their day, but somehow Sweeney it's deploying that voice, but to a heightened idea somehow, isn't it?
Yeah, and I don't know. You have to be a particular craftsperson to be able to deploy it in that way. And I've since reading the Owl, I've gone back and looked at some of his other work, and it was always like that. Which is, I mean, Jack for me was his champion who kept telling me that I need to read him, I should read him. And I can see like how the writing is understated. It's not performative. It's not showy. It's not exuberant. It has a kind of a coolness to it, but also a wit, and it's that wit and that humor that in the introduction she mentions it as well. But that's what I think separates Sweeney from a lot of his contemporaries, is the humor that is never lost, and it's a wry humor as well. Like it's not kind of knock who's there. There's something going on that it just makes you laugh, but in quite a sinister, like there's just something. There's a dark humor there for sure.
Absolutely. I think we there should be more knock jokes in poetry though. But just as an aside, but you mentioned that you'd kind of been reminded of a couple of your favourites. I wondered if you wanted to just read one, maybe, or even a part of the owl sequence that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I was going to read number 4, because I think this one is kind of emblematic of the book's mission, of its enterprise, and the way in which, like, the kind of central ideas that the book's kind of wrestling with. And this is number 4, so it's on page 22 for anyone following along in the text over there. So actually it's on page 20 on the PDF. So I've heard stories about owls, how they appear from nowhere at the edge of things to sit watching, usually staying silent, but sometimes uttering a few words in their night language we don't understand. That's my fellow, although I don't know him. Should I leave the house and hold my right arm out for him to land on and turn his big eyes on me, as if he'd be so compliant? Or should I try to forget him, pretend he's not there in the dark, like a tree I hadn't noticed growing? Oh, at least I should stop mentioning him here. But what else can I write about? Not the journey I'm taking that I know nothing of, not yet. And when I do, I mightn't feel like writing. I think the solution might be to buy a T-shirt with an owl printed on it, a blue owl on a yellow shirt, and write about that small fellow to begin with.
Fantastic. So tell us what it is about that one that feels so emblematic of kind of Sweeney and of this book, Anthony.
I think because the owl just takes on so many different kind of characters in the poem. There's this idea of this mysticism, like, who is this owl? Like, I'm going to meet this owl, but I don't really know who he is. And I need to kind of somehow prepare for the meeting, for the grand meeting. Should I leave the house and hold my right arm out? So there's this idea of like wanting to accept your fate, your destiny. This is what's going to happen, with his big eyes on me. As if he'd be so compliant. And I think it's that there's this owl. The owl is mischievous, and it's that mischievous that I think is actually Matthew Sweeney, kind of his personality coming through on the page. Or should I try to forget him, pretend he's not there in the dark, like a tree I hadn't noticed growing? And it's these really gentle similes that, again, they're not forced. They're not really trying to win the reader over. They don't feel performative or spurious. They're just there. And trees dying, growing, becoming something else. It's all entwined in the thinking, the mechanics of the thing. And should I stop mentioning him here? Like, stop going on about it. We get it. It's got the obsession, and also like you start to just irritate yourself because of the fact that you keep obsessing over this one particular thing. So it's got that annoyance. The speaker's almost annoyed with himself in the poem too, which is what happens throughout the whole book, I think. And then the thing at the end with the T-shirt almost undermines the function of the owl. It's got this trolling effect. I'm just going to get a T-shirt and I'm going to stick your face on it and we'll call it that. And he calls him a small fellow as well, like, right, nothing big or omnipotent, just like this small fellow to begin with. I really like it.
And it struck me as you were talking about it then, Anthony, I wonder if there's something like John Berryman's dream songs, like this kind of projection of a kind of playful version of herself within a poem that someone's like toying with somehow.
I think you get a lot of that. I mean, I didn't know Sweeney, but I remember when he died, Jack wrote in his obituary that he had a grin like a rusted zip. And it was just it was that image, a grin like a rusted zip, and it was that image that I'll think it makes so much sense reading his poetry, that you can see the kind of cheeky, the tongue in cheek, the ironic kind of, you know, satire. You can see it all happening in here, and I think it takes a particular kind of personality as well to be able to engage the language in this way, and then also put so much of yourself in the writing. You know, like from what the stories I've heard about him, this is pretty much him. You know, it's very unedited.
And I think, and like you were saying, like with that kind of casual voice, it's that asking sometimes, because I find questions sometimes quite odd in poetry, because I'm never sure whether they're being addressed to a reader or to someone else on the page, but here it feels like I'm being directly asked, doesn't it? Like, should I try and forget him, or turn his big eyes on me? Like, it feels as though, as you're saying, we could be in a pub and he might be about to ask to pass the salt. Like, there's that kind of quality to it, isn't there? Where the questions feel that they're coming directly at you as a reader.
Yeah. But then at the same time, every line is working so hard. And I think that's what is, you know, that's remarkable to have it do this. And I think that's what struck me, because, you know, coming from spoken word, so much of the stuff that I remember reading and writing in my early days was talky, was conversational, but it didn't have the weight, the kind of gravitas that this kind of does. And I feel that, you know, like it makes me think about how writing like this can work. It doesn't have to always, you can be more understated, more casual, but still have that kind of latitudinal shift that moves it around the page in the way that it does here.
I think, like, it struck me again as you were reading, there's that beautiful part quite near the top when it says, the owls sit watching, they usually stay silent, but sometimes uttering a few words in their night language we don't understand. And like most poets, like I would have sat and sweated for ages thinking about what's the exact description of the sound of that hoot, and I'll try and come up with a new metaphor or simile. And it just goes, oh, it's their night language we don't understand. And it's that casualness, but the cleverness of that phraseology, isn't it, I think?
But it's also the conviction of the line. That's what I think it is, because he goes in. I mean, a lot of the lines, you know, most poetry is nonsense, right? But if you can put it together, if you can put it convincingly, and I guess that's the truth, that's the logic of the poem, that the reader then renders that logic and internalizes it and believes it. And I think that's what Sweeney's so good at. I literally feel there's an owl on his wall, and every day and every night he's having a pop at this owl and saying, just fuck off, like it's not my time yet. But he can't, you know, like the owl just keeps changing. It's just, yeah, man, like he's got a lot, there's a lot happening here.
There is, and as you say, and then those preoccupations and those ideas then really take flight, or the shadow of that is cast then through the rest of the book, isn't it? And I was reminded, looking back through it, there are these final poems at the end, just kind of called last poems, that are incredibly moving, where almost like you still get that humour and that wryness to the voice, but everything else is stripped away. And there's just this kind of like that final poem, Mouse Sandwich, that after they gave me morphine following the incident when my heart stopped for 8 minutes and a bunch of doctors in red suits attached a loose curtain of coloured wires to my body, I woke up in intensive care to later try to sleep again. There's that surreal kind of hint, or that glint is still there, but most of it's been stripped back, hasn't it? And he enters these kind of very raw final moments, I guess.
100%. I mean, it takes on a very prosaic life, and I think a lot of the kind of theatrics and the pyrotechnics that we often associate with, you know, good poetry, the tricks, the poetry tricks, all that gets stripped away, and you're just left with a person and their reckoning and the blunt truth of their life.
I think that's real. And does that sort of suggest, I mean, God, this is a big question for Thursday night, but does that suggest that faced with stuff like that, that those kind of tricks aren't enough, and actually that's when it becomes a more kind of plainer or direct attempt to say something?
For sure. I think you see it with Ritvo as well, and a lot of other kind of poets who, you know, are terminally ill and are suffering, and as the kind of work progresses, as they come closer and closer to the end, things get really just blunt, and you see it also in war poetry, you know, the poetry of World War I and World War II. you see a lot of that. Like the lines get shorter, the poems get shorter, the nuance just starts to go, because nuance in a sense is a dilution of the truth. And so what happens is that the truth is looking at them, and so they start to feel that I've got no time to disguise anything. There's no room for subtlety. It's this urgent and this big. This is what it is. There's nothing else going on around it. I think there's something really moving about knowing a poet can work in these different spaces, and then just seeing those last lines laid out bare, you know, to resemble the situation.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, like mentioning Max Ripko, I think, and just for people that might not have kind of heard his name or kind of know about him, just say a little bit about him, because I think he's interesting as a kind of transatlantic comparison.
Yeah, so Max was, I think he died from a very rare form of cancer. I'm just trying to find the book here. So yeah, he died from a very rare form of cancer out in the States, and he was another one who's very highly kind of revered and spoken about over there. I think he was like 22, 23.
Yeah.
And yeah, like again, his kind of book was Reckoning. I think it is for Reincarnation. So yeah, here's the book. A beautiful looking book there. And yeah, he was kind of reckoning with his days, but he's slightly different to Sweeney, I would say. Like he's a bit more technical. He's kind of a lot more playful, imagistically, more surreal. But again, like the things that he brings in are all I want to live. And I think this is for me what I kept thinking with Sweeney. The closing line of the 12th stanza, then far off I heard a faint hoo-hoo-hoo, followed by a hoo-hoo. You cowardly bastard, I roared, and sprayed the arrows all over the blackened world. And it's that, yeah, it's that, that's the closing thought. And it was, and again, he's got the onomatopoeia, he's got these playfulness, it's conversational. Maybe you talk like this to a child, I don't know, but it's you cowardly bastard, italicized, I roared, and sprayed the arrows, which has that Larkin, you know, when you close a poem with arrows, it hints, for me anyway, like I just think of the Whitsun wedding. And so, yeah. I just think there's something to be said. And I'm sure there's more poets who wrote and who were writing whilst faced with terminal illnesses. But Max is one, for some reason, there's a strong correlation between that.
I just think that's a really interesting connection, because I'd not kind of thought of that before, and to kind of pair those together. And I think oftentimes there is still very little poetry, I think, written from, you know, oftentimes we remember poets who died young unexpectedly, and, you know, people like Keats still kind of live on. But poetry from the experience of knowing one's own demise is coming is something that I still think is quite rare, isn't it? Like, it's something that haunts all poets. Like you mentioned Larkin. Larkin always said, I fear permanent extinction. Like, kind of, we're all scared of dying. But something about facing that through poetry that still feels underexplored in contemporary poetry. Yeah,
I mean, it is a taboo, and I think that, I mean, it does feel like a taboo because no one wants to. I don't know about read. I mean, you know, we talk about Rebecca Goss. I mean, there's a lot of mothers who have written about, you know, their relationship to children who have died, stillborn children, all that kind of thing. And for me, it's tough reading. Like, it's difficult getting through that stuff. And I also notice, again, like when we talk about mortality in this sense, that the nuance gets stripped away. Because even with her birth, Rebecca Goss's Her Birth, I remember reading that about a month before I was going to become a dad. And it completely, like, broke me. Like, it was one of the hardest books. That one and W.S. Merwin Garden Time. Yeah. Again, like, two of the saddest poetry collections I think I've read in a while. Malika was asking what the book was. Oh, that's it, Malika. There, it's Max Ripko for Reincarnations.
Fantastic. That we were talking about. So, I mean, it's been wonderful to chat about Matthew Sweeney. I just think to keep his name alive, as it were, and to kind of hopefully find him more readers. But I wonder, just before we finish, Anthony, and I bring in Nee, is there another poem from the book that you might read to us to finish off?
Let me go down and shall I read? I can read the 12 because you read the last words one. What about the number 12 on the sequence?
Or that'd be a great one. Down? Yeah, let's do that.
All right. So this is the last one that finished off the hour sequence. When the dark came, I lurked in the kitchen, bow in hand, arrows in the quiver that hung from my left shoulder. Like the Robin Hood I wanted to play in the school pantomime, I got Little John instead. I kept looking out at the garden, wondering if I should be there, waiting to fire arrows at any sound or movement. Why did I want to kill the owl? He hadn't given me the news I dreaded, but he'd stayed silent. That was more than I could bear. I poured a glass of Malbec and put on a CD of Baltic jazz. Did he think I could wait forever, as if I were a rock? I sliced some cheddar and a heel of bread, opened the back door and went out. The moon turned its big eye onto me, and I saw it wobble. The stars hummed along. Where am I going? I shouted at all of them. There was no response. Then far off, I heard a faint whoo-hoo-hoo, followed by a whoo-hoo. You cowardly bastard, I roared, and sprayed the arrows all over the blackened world.
It's such a great ending, that, isn't it?
Right. Yeah,
it's such a brilliant ending. And that was so well read as well.
Thanks, man.
Thanks so much for joining us, and again for choosing this as a wildcard selection. We've not revealed the spring one, so we can't say what it is, but have you chosen the spring wildcard as well?
I haven't, not yet.
Okay.
I'm going to wait to see what you guys do, and then I'll run off that.
Okay, perfect. Well, thanks ever so much as ever for joining us, Anthony. It's always a joy to talk to you, and I'm just hoping some point soon we can do it in person. But until then, thank you very much.
Thanks, Andrew. Take care of yourself, man.
You too. Thank you.
See ya. Bye-bye. Bye.
So that was Anthony Anaxagorou, who chooses the PBS wildcard choice for us every time here at the Poetry Book Society. And this time it is the great late Matthew Sweeney and Shadow of the Owl, published by Blood Axe Books and out now. And so I'm going to move on now, and I'm going to talk to the wonderful Ni Ayikwei Parks. And I'm so excited about this because I've actually been teaching a poem from this book to my students this week. So I might ask a little bit about that, but also about the book more generally. And I can see that Ni's commenting, so I know that he's here, so that's a good thing. And so Ni Ayikwei Parks' new collection, The Gaze, is published by People Tree Press, and is out now, and is a Poetry Book Society recommendation for winter 2020, and it's a book that just blew me away. I'm kind of beguiled by this book, and I'm so thrilled that Ni is able to join us, and so I'm going to invite him in now to join our conversation. So I'm just going to find him in this epic list of the great and the good of poetry and other art forms, and here we go.
Hello.
Hello, how are you doing?
I'm good.
Good. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
No, I'm just so thrilled that we get to talk about this book. And before we get into anything, I just wondered if you could read us a poem from it.
Oh, yeah, certainly. I will read a little section from a sequence called Caress, which is all about how the body receives and expresses emotion, which to some degree most of the poems in this book are about as well. But so it's a very short piece, and that way we get into the talking. One child I planted tomatoes with, because for a time there was a patch of gardening space and sun. Another spoke beautifully with my tongue, his eyes set in his grandfather's face. A third held me by the mouth, kissed me, caressed my cheek, and said, "Daddy," making my heart thud at dawn each time I remember. There are songs I've sung to all my children, words I stole from tunes shaped in the mouth of my mother. Thus, the body is echo chamber and memory. All its parts triggers, every bruise, history, melody. I carry all my dreams, not as I imagined, but the heft holds. Every flower has fallen to yield some peculiar fruit.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that. And what a great way to kind of introduce the chat. And I mean, first of all, I mean, there's so much I kind of want to get to, but I just wondered, first of all, how it feels to have this book out in the world, and what you said a little bit about this, but what for you feel the book is about, I guess.
I'm always relieved to have a book out, because it means I don't have to worry about compiling stuff or talking about editing for a short while. I spend most of my days editing poetry anyway. So, as much as I'm compelled by whatever's going on to kind of write and edit my own work, I always feel like I have other things to do. So there's always this pull, there's this tension between my own writing and the work I do editing other people. Yeah. So the first thing is relief. But the book really is about, and the title's kind of playing with that a little bit. It's about the gaze, it's about the difference between what we see, or the tension between what we see and what actually is. Yeah. Because this is, when somebody is dying, sometimes you don't know until they tell you, right? So, to connect to Matthew, when I met Matthew, he was already dying in Libya, but you wouldn't know to talk to him and when he cracked his jokes and that smile of his, all of that stuff. So yeah, the gaze is about that, but it's in 4 sections. So it's enabled me to play with more freedom. Yeah. Sometimes I find that structure gives you more freedom to play. So at the first section, so again, I'm playing on many levels. So the title is The Gaze, and that word and that pronunciation is taken from the old script in which Amharic is written, one of the oldest languages in the world. But then the sections all start with a letter from that. So the first is game, and in game I'm playing with form and with actual games, sports, that kind of thing. And then E, the first E is eros, which is to do with love. The second E is O, which is water, but also I chose because of the sound, because water goes everywhere, like gossip, and so the whole O is like, oh, yeah. So how do these things link? It's that thing of that curiosity that you get when you hear some information and then it connects to something else later, that type of thing. And then the Z is zest, which for me was all about poems that connect with popular culture in some way, and how popular culture kind of infuses our lives and sometimes saves our lives and sometimes destroys our lives, all of that stuff.
Fantastic. And so I was really struck by when you said, that kind of the structure can actually give freedom. Because one of the things I was really keen to talk about was kind of form and maybe the gimbal in a short while, but all these poems in this book in some way are kind of in conversation with different forms, with new forms, with ways of organizing the words on the page, aren't they? In a way that enhances what they want to say. So even a poem like Breakable that has this slash between break and then able.
Yes.
And then that kind of slash follows through in some of the words in a way that means that we can read them in 2 different ways. And I just guess as a poet reading this, and then for poets in the audience, do those formal decisions come quite early on, or do they come in a redraft, or kind of how is it that you're finding what always seems to me the perfect formal structure for what that individual poem wants to say?
For me, I think a lot of the creative process is play. I wouldn't do this if I didn't enjoy it. So I write longhand. Right. So it's one of the first places where these things start to come about. So I will write a poem and then I'll notice that, maybe some words can have double meanings. And again, because English is a kind of second language to me, so I have a kind of emotional distance from it as well. Yeah. And so it's almost like it's jigsaw, it's Lego. I can play around with it. And then, of course, when you have other languages, every other language can give you jokes in the extra languages that you have. And so, there's all kinds of sonic and structural things that can emerge just from that exposure to different languages. And I think that's really part of it. But also, I just really love playing. I love playing with words. And that's how it comes about. So initially I start out playing, and then, if it makes sense and it still ultimately has to be true to the poem, to the spirit of the poem. And that's really important. So I very often, and when I'm teaching as well, I say to people, you can start playing with the poem, but write alongside it the initial thing that triggered you. The initial thing, the emotion, where the emotional truth that you wanted to get to right alongside it. So when you're playing, you never get diverted from that, and that will kind of guide you. So yeah,
I love
I've
that.
always been an admirer of jazz music as well, and particularly I always go back to the story of the recording of Miles Davis's Kind of Blue, and the fact that it had this kind of, there was a structure in the sense that it said he would say play in these modes, but the rest of it was up to you.
Yeah.
And that's how I like to play with the poems.
I love that idea of kind of the play, but always keep in mind that emotional reason that the poem was being written. And that's where I think other poets get lost, isn't it? It becomes all about the play and they lose that kind of heart to it, maybe. And I said, like, I was teaching you this week because we were looking at form this week with my undergraduate students, and I really wanted to do the gimbal with them. And so we did like the sonnet and the villanelle. And then we did this kind of form that you've developed, this new form of the gimbal, and that I'm just fascinated by and I'm obsessed by now. And I, first of all, I mean, I don't know if I'm clever enough to pull it off, but just first of all, tell us what, from your point of view, what that is, or kind of what this form is that you've developed.
So it's a form that I developed to, again, so this is kind of giving order to chaos. My father died 26 years ago, so a long time ago. It's actually coming up to 27. And one of the things that has happened with time is I've realized that the grief, it doesn't go away, right? You carry it the whole time. And so how do you deal with it? How do you express it? And what happens is your relationship to that grief changes with time. So as I've become a father, my grief was renewed and then restabilized, because it was, I wish you'd met my father kind of grief, right? Yeah. The silly jokes and stuff like that. And then you see in your children like expressions, that physical expressions, ways of expressing themselves that seem to be hereditary, and you can't, you can't figure it out. And so you have all of these repeated reminders. And so for me, I want to kind of talk about that grief, but with some order, so it wasn't just chaotic. So I started playing with a piece which is in the book called Of Serendipity. So that was the first gimbal I wrote. Right. And I must have about 12 versions of that, as prose poem, as a block, as triplets. There's all kinds of things, but it just didn't feel right. I was just trying to find the way to do it. And ultimately, when I got to the point where I had done it, I started to study it, because it's one of the things that I've started doing after I started teaching is really to interrogate, the work afterwards, and think, okay, why does it work? And I realized that what it does, the gimbal does, because you've got your 5 lines, your 1 line, your 4 line, 1 line. It allows you to breathe in the same way that when you're expressing emotions, you kind of you gush and then you pause for realization and then you carry on. Yeah. And so there is that, but also there's a transition from logic into emotion. So if you look at the gimbals, you see that the more emotional parts come after the turn in the middle, which is where you find it's almost like at that point I think, okay, I'm ready to go in now, and then going in again. And so there is that transition. And so once I interrogated it and understood it, I was able to then use it to kind of explore with other poems. And then I was able to go away from just grief to also celebration, because emotion is emotion. But it's that understanding, that structure of, the logic allows you to kind of start to interrogate why you're feeling this way. Yeah. And then by the time you get to the point in the middle where you nail that, you can start to cry or laugh or whatever it is that you want to do. And so that's how it felt like for me. And the name comes from, if you read the poem Of Serendipity, I'm talking about my father explaining gyroscopes to me. And gyroscopes have these gimbals. I was always fascinated, how do these things keep spinning? And, kind of he explained. And so this is, the thing is like, okay, so these are the things that keep it going. And it's these single lines, which are almost the anchors that you kind of, you go from and then gush again.
I think it's so true, isn't it? So they have in the middle this kind of, that central pivot line, don't they? That kind of, that, as you say, that it allows both this kind of intellectual exploration of something, or this kind of exploring why I feel like something, and then that central pivot line that just seems to me to put it on the line and just say, well, but maybe it's this kind of emotional truth that from then the second half of the poem kind of turns out from, doesn't it? That central line is the hinge, or that bolter almost.
It's very much so. Yeah.
It's such a clever thing. And I think it's, and it's interesting how you say, you know, you wrote one and then studied it to see what it allowed, or we're writing and then kind of studying it to see what it allowed. And now it's moved into celebration. So it kind of keeps morphing as a potential form as well, or it keeps shifting. The possibilities of what it might do keep shifting. Yeah,
very much so. And yeah, I really enjoyed once I understood it.
Yeah.
Again, you've got that form, and now it gives you a freedom to kind of explore emotions that maybe before you just thought maybe this is a bit too big for me, you know, and then suddenly I feel, well, maybe the gimbal can help me, you know, kind of thing.
And I think you mentioned at the start, as you're introducing the book, that kind of structure, and one of them is eros, and these kind of very sensual poems and kind of sexual poems of the body. And it seems to me that I think it's very hard to do that well, and that this book is so accomplished at writing of the body, both the body, one's own body, and other people's bodies, and the female body. And just because I think there's such a fine balance when doing that. I think I struggle sometimes to get that balance right. And I wonder, how do you know how much to plainly tell the reader and how much to kind of hold back? To make, there's that kind of fine line, I think, within these poems walk so well between showing us something directly and then holding back that kind of bit of sensual mystery. And again, does that just come through experimentation, or through kind of playing with the poems themselves, or just is it instinct to know just how much to show to the reader?
I mean, there's a bit of experimentation, but I think there's also attentiveness to the human condition. I mean, if you ever had conversations with friends about intimacy, you can tell the point at which they start to get uncomfortable, right? So you have to be aware of that. But there's also, I think intimacy is intimacy, right? So there's some stuff that's private. So what do you share? What don't you share? Is also about, if I was in a relationship with somebody, what would they be comfortable with me talking about?
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's, you know, there is that. And for me, everyone I've ever been in a relationship with, I have extreme respect for, and because I think they've all brought something valuable to my life. And part of that value is a kind of awareness of my own body, because with everybody that you're intimate with, there's an extra awareness of your own body that comes because you're compromising. You know, two bodies come together in compromise always. Always. And so you learn from that if you're attentive, and I think really that's what it is. I think age, you know, I'm not young anymore, so the way I would have written about these things in my 20s has shifted. I mean, I think I would always be sensitive, but I think if you add another 10 years, you have more experience, and so you have more nuance. You know, not to say, so I think there is that, but a lot of it is also, you know, gauging it. You read it to yourself. Like I said, you always keep in mind what's the emotion you want to convey.
Yeah.
And then if you've gone overboard, is this necessary for me to feel this emotion? You have to ask yourself that question. So I only give as much as is necessary, because there's also the side of, you have to allow enough for the reader to be able to put themselves in it.
Yeah.
And when you give too much, the reader can't go there. And I think that's really, really important. I mean, you teach, so you know this. One of the things that I find, I didn't study literature, and I think one of the reasons instinctively I didn't, talking to my cousins and friends who did, is this thing of when a teacher imposes on you how you must feel about something, must feel about a poem or a short story or something like that. And I think that informs how I write as well, because I don't want to tell the reader how to feel.
Yeah.
So I have to give enough space. I have to give enough for them to say, oh yeah, I get that, but not to spell out exactly, you know, how to engage with it.
Yeah.
And so I think that comes from teaching as well. Yeah.
I think it's, and it's so interesting that, because I think you mentioned that kind of, the gaze, that kind of pun on the gaze in the title, and that then runs through the book. Because when we have to do these like write-ups for the magazine when the books come out, and one of the things that I think, one of the real strengths of this book is how they're able to look somehow, they're still tethered to a kind of youthful experience that shapes some of them. They're able to kind of look backwards, but they're also rooted in this kind of middle-aged experience, as you said, of being a father and things like that. And they're able to both kind of look forwards and backwards at the same time. So there's a great line in one of them: the 21-year gap in betrayals hasn't changed you. And so we're in the contemporary moment, but we're looking backwards at the same time. And that seemed to me to be kind of one of the strengths, and also that they have this real propulsion in them. The poems always feel as though they keep moving. So there's that kind of final moment in the collection: some nights my sleep wants company and it won't settle its voguing self for less. The collection kind of there's this movement in it all the way through, this kind of real propulsion in it. And I just wondered if, again, it felt like a collection that, as you were writing it, was coming from a very certain point in your life where you were both looking at the kids and looking towards the future, but also kind of still carrying some of that youthful experience, or kind of looking backwards as well. Did it feel like that kind of pivot, almost like that moment in the gimbal that could kind of both propel you forward, but also hold you back to that other space?
I think part of that's cultural. In Ghana, we have a philosophy, which is encapsulated in a symbol, an Edinkra symbol called Sankofa, which means you have to go back to go forwards. And the philosophy that underlies that symbol is, if you're walking down a path and you see something on the floor, if you don't pick it up, you're leaving a blessing behind. But if you do pick it up, you're picking up a curse, right? So it's that thing of you never know. And so for us, our ancestors are very much connected to us. And those who come after us are connected to the ancestors through us. So we're never alone. I'm a conduit. I am a link in a chain between my ancestors and my children and my children's children and my children's children's children, who I won't meet. So I'm never not here. So within that, there's also, I really believe that in life you have to maintain your curiosity. And I think curiosity is a very youthful thing. It's one of the things that we kind of let go sometimes when we're growing up. This way of children walking into the room and wanting to understand absolutely everything, even if it will burn their fingers, right? And I think you learn caution, and sometimes you leave that behind. But I also think there's something to be gained by not losing that entirely. And I think that's probably the youthful energy, is that curiosity that I maintain, about the world. Sometimes I ask my kids questions, and they're like, "Dad, you ask more questions than we do." And that's it.
That's such a great answer, Nee. Thank you. And again, if people have got questions, do throw them into the box as we kind of move into the last sort of 7 or 8 minutes. One of the other poems that I really love, this isn't really a question, I just wanted to rave about this poem called Offside, where we observe this kind of, it's men examining male behaviour, but it's the eye of the poem explaining to a sister about, and that was so interesting, because I thought that was there are oftentimes poems about that kind of examine male behaviour, but because it's someone explaining it to the sister about how boys behave, it just gives a new perspective. So it allows us to, the gaze, as it were, is shifted, isn't it? It allows us to see it in a new way, because there's a fraternal or a paternal bond in that we don't often see when we're thinking about that world of men, I guess.
Yes. I mean, so I have 2 brothers and a sister. So my sister was your quintessential tomboy. And she was more successful as a footballer than any of us were. She was her school team. They would be carrying her because she scored a goal. I mean, we all played, but, none of us. But so it was that we definitely had that relationship where we were schooling her on how to be, but we were schooling her boy stuff, and it was all that we could school her on. Yeah, and she absolutely, she's completely lovable. Yeah. So it's that relationship, and I feel like sometimes we don't explore our sibling relationships enough, and certainly the relationship between sisters and brothers, because we have remained very close, but obviously at some point, she's dealing with different things than we're dealing with.
Yeah.
But we keep the bond, and it's about how to kind of stay close.
Thank you so much. And
Yeah.
before we hear a final poem from the book, which I'm really keen to do, I think it was Malika who was just asking for a really, really quick kind of breakdown of what the gimbal form actually is. So if someone wants to write one, it's kind of five.
Yes.
Well, just kind of, it's 5 lines.
Yeah. So it's
kind of the breakdown.
5 lines, 1 line, 4 lines, 1 line, 4 lines, 1 line, 5 lines.
There we go.
Yeah. So it's symmetrical. And the important thing is there are 3 single lines, and they are the gimbals. So they hold the poem together. So they tend to be moments of clarity, the one in the center being the one that links the what should I say, intellectual to the emotional.
Yeah.
And so normally if you read the central line, it should really give you a sense of the poem.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things I also really work hard on, and I try to teach, is every line must have its own integrity.
Yeah.
It must have its own life. And it's one of the things that that allows the gimbal to work.
Yeah.
Because each of those lines, kind of, you could read them on their own.
Absolutely.
But they, when they work back and forth, it's really, it really works together. So yeah, it goes from intellectual to emotional. So after 5, 1, 4, 1. So after the 10th line, so the 11th line is the central line.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
So just before we finish, I just want to ask you if you'd like to read us another poem from the book, just to close off the evening.
Yes. Maybe I should read Offside.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Offside. Because I know about green mangoes more than I know about any woman, I teach my sister about boys, how to think like one, play one step ahead. I tell her not to step back anytime they lunge forward, but to sidestep, stay focused, show no fear. I show her the same thing works in football, how before the age of positions, they rush like dogs. That's when you pass and move. Hold on for a minute, then accelerate. Speed combined with timing, like a good joke, and you have beaten the offside trap. I teach her to punch too, and for good measure, where. By 16, maths is play for her. She has boys wrapped for her punchlines, waiting, hoping for a chance to slip a line of their own in. She falls them all. Years later, when she has settled, done her 38 weeks, I get the call. I am told, it's a boy, it's a boy, it's a boy, it's a boy. And that's Offside.
Thank you so much for that. It's such a great poem.
Thank you.
Before the age of positions, they rush like dogs, and just the layers of meaning that are in that is just...
Oh, yeah. No, I love a good innuendo.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Ian. Thanks so much for this book, for the game.
Thank you.
It's such a wonderful book, and I'm just so thrilled that we were able to recommend it for the Poetry Book Society. So thank you very much to everyone for listening.
Thank you for all the work you do in promoting poetry as the Poetry Book Society, and allowing people to kind of engage with work they wouldn't have otherwise found. It's a really, really important thing to do.
Good. Well, you know, thank you so much then to Ni Ayikwei Parks, and The Gaze is out now by People Tree Press, and we've heard from Anthony talking about Matthew Sweeney, Shadow of the Owl, that's published by Blood Axe Books as well. So remember, join up with the PBS if you can, kind of have a look at the other recommendations, and hopefully we'll be back again soon with another Poetry Book Society book club. But thank you very much for joining us, and thanks again, Ni. That was sublime.
Thank you.
Have a good
Thank
night.
you. All right, bye.